This is the Republic of China, or Taiwan, and this is the People's Republic of China, or just China. As you've probably heard, there's been a fair bit of tension between these two nations over the past number of years. Many analysts increasingly believe that Beijing is set to launch an invasion of Taiwan sometime between now and next year. Last year, I had the opportunity to visit Taiwan with some colleagues from around the world. There I am, right there. But in the 10 days I spent on the island, speaking to high-ranking government officials, military strategists, technologists, journalists, and even listening to the president of Taiwan himself, it left me thinking that there's a lot more to the story that you probably don't normally hear in the media. Yes, there is the terrifying prospect of a full-scale Chinese invasion of the island. It's very possible, perhaps even likely. But I want to look at what's happening right now, because there's already a Cold War being fought across the Taiwan Strait. And it's a fascinating story of technology, propaganda, and diplomacy. And what happens next could determine whether or not this war goes hot. My name is Justin Ling, and this is Soft Power, a show all about how diplomacy, security, aid, trade, spying, and realpolitik shapes the world. On this episode, I want to walk you through two very different philosophies about the future of Taiwan. On one side, there's the not today doctrine, and on the other, there's the plan to take Taiwan without firing a shot. Alright, let's start, as always, with a little bit of history. We're going to start at the very end of the Second World War. China was then essentially split into three. Parts were still controlled by Japan, though they had surrendered. Parts were controlled by the central government, known as the Nationalists, and there were parts that were run by a communist insurgency. With the Japanese gone, the Communists and Nationalists spent the next 4 years wrestling for control of the country, fighting a brutal civil war. Leading the Nationalists, known as the Kuomintang, was Chiang Kai-shek. The revolutionary leader of the Chinese Communist Party was, as you probably know, Mao Zedong. This 4-year war was brutal, and it ended with a communist victory in late 1949. That's when Chiang Kai-shek and his forces staged a retreat from mainland China to the island of Taiwan. This was not a resolution by any means. Kai-shek and the Kuomintang formed an independent government in Taipei, but they vowed to one day reclaim control of China. Mao, meanwhile, vowed to one day reunify Taiwan with the rest of China. Both of these men, however, died without realizing their dreams. Kai-shek in 1975 and Mao a year later. And that's been more or less the status quo since then.
Since 1949, this narrow body of water has been both a symbolic and a realistic moat, separating the Taiwan island complex from the coast of the communist-held mainland of China.
With Mao dead, the quest to make China whole fell to his successors. One of them was a man named Shi Zhongxun, but despite years of secret negotiations with Taiwan, he too failed. He bequeathed this mission once more to the next generation, specifically to his son Xi Jinping. This guy. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Taiwan Strait, the dream of sweeping the communists from the mainland really died with Kai-shek. Still, his Kuomintang, or the KMT, stayed in power even after his death. And Taiwan stayed under martial law until 1987. But since then, Taiwan has become a progressive and liberal, albeit somewhat chaotic, democracy. And it has also become central to the world addiction with technology. It makes about 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors necessary to power cell phones, laptops, and other tech on which you can watch these videos. Today, China and Taiwan are radically different places. But Xi Jinping has a plan to change that. Since he became premier in 2012, the younger Xi has been laying the groundwork to gain control over Taiwan. He coined a phrase that now governs Beijing's approach. He says that both sides of the Taiwan Strait are one family.
两岸同胞一家亲，谁也无法隔断我们的血脉亲情，谁也不能阻挡祖国统一的历史大势。
That may sound pleasant enough, but there has been a growing belief that he intends to unify this supposed family by force. Over his tenure, China has doubled its annual defense spending, and while there is no doubt that this spending has been part of a strategic competition with the United States, we can find ample evidence that China is also preparing for a war with its neighbor. Last year, videos emerged, for example, of the Chinese military testing out these massive barges, ideal for an amphibious assault. Taiwanese defense analysts say there isn't much ambiguity about what these are for. They're for invading Taiwan. But as impressive as the People's Liberation Army is, it's fair to say that it's still not quite ready for a full invasion of Taiwan. Xi may not need to start a massive war in order to take Taiwan. He may instead try a different tactic. It's what's called the Beiping model. And sorry, here's one more history lesson. In 1949, communist forces were sweeping through China, and the nationalists were trying desperately to hold on. We know they were unsuccessful. But one of the most critical moments in this fight was the siege of Beiping. It's what we call now Beijing. Inside the city were 250,000 nationalist troops. But rather than storm the city, which would have been an enormously deadly assault, the communists waited. And they kept waiting. And they began a psychological campaign to convince the nationalist commander to simply surrender. In particular, they maintained an extensive spy network in the city. Their job wasn't just to steal and pass on information to the communist forces, but it was also to actively convince the nationalist leadership and the citizens inside the city to surrender. This network included the commanding officer's daughter and his secretary. And it worked. Thanks in part to the lobbying of his daughter, the nationalist general surrendered and officially joined the Communist Party. It was victory without firing a shot. There's good reason to think that Xi Jinping thinks he can do something very similar in Taiwan. Analysts increasingly estimate that China will not invade Taiwan per se, but encircle it, putting the island on a total embargo as it cuts off goods and supplies. They believe that Beijing will try and convince the island to capitulate without any bloodshed. And there's growing evidence that China has been working feverishly to recruit that network of spies, the ones who could help turn public favor towards China, or at least towards surrender.
Taiwan has charged a military officer with spying for China.
Prosecutors in the southern Taiwanese city of Kaohsiung have arrested 3 men on suspicion of spying for China.
Another Taiwanese military officer has been indicted for sharing sensitive military information with China.
Taiwan's defense ministry says it has uncovered a link in a military spy network working for China.
The National Security Bureau estimates some 5,000 spies have been operating across government.
2 soldiers in the group are accused of filming videos for Chinese propaganda. More than 21 high-level Taiwanese officers have been convicted of spying for China in the last 10 years.
Now, on top of the spy network, there is evidence that China has been deploying another kind of tactic, a very modern 2026 strategy: influencers. In 2024, YouTuber Ba Jiang, and I'll link to his channel right here, released a bombshell documentary exposing how Chinese agents have been trying to bribe Taiwanese influencers to regurgitate pro-reunification content.
47,000 US dollars per month. That's how much China is offering people to push its propaganda online.
This is on top of a ton of other Chinese influencers who are operating in Taiwan. This effort extends, of course, to one of the biggest sources of Chinese soft power, TikTok. Last year, Doublethink Lab, which studies disinformation narratives in Taiwan, studied political narratives common on TikTok, which, recall, is owned by a Chinese company but is forbidden on mainland China. Doublethink surveyed frequent TikTok users in Taiwan and found they frequently get pro-reunification content, as well as videos downplaying the severity of a possible invasion. What's more, Doublethink found that frequent TikTok users were significantly more favorable towards reunification. So what you've got here is a pervasive and escalating effort to recruit agents and defectors within the Taiwanese military, to tap influencers to spread pro-reunification content, and to weaponize one of the world's most popular social media apps to shape the minds of a young Taiwanese population. So now the question is, what is Taiwan going to do about it? Let's start with the prospect of a full military invasion of Taiwan. The short of it is, Taiwan would be pretty dramatically outmatched. War games conducted by analysts around the world estimate that Taiwan could probably hold off the invasion for somewhere between a couple of weeks and maybe a few months. But they all agree that China's overwhelming military dominance would ultimately win out. That is, unless Taiwan's allies intervene. Analysts say that if American forces sail for Taiwan to counter China's invading forces, especially if they're backed up by the navies and air forces of Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, and others, it would probably end in defeat for China. Now, what exactly this allied defense would look like is still pretty murky. For years, America maintained what it called strategic ambiguity. It provided defensive weapons, and it suggested it might intervene if China invaded, but it's never been quite clear what America would or wouldn't do, and it's become even less clear over the past year, for obvious reasons. Regardless of who would be able to claim victory in this totally unnecessary war, there would no doubt be losses on an enormous scale, regardless of who intervenes. Now, when I first arrived in Taiwan, I expected that this would be the topic of conversation. And certainly, I did speak to defense analysts, politicians, and journalists who were pretty freaked out and who were thinking about how to prepare and prevent such a war. But speaking to regular Taiwanese people, there seemed to be this kind of attitude of, it probably won't happen, and if it does, there's not much we can do about it. I wanted to unpack this sentiment a little bit, so I called up Brian Hugh. He's one of the journalists I met in Taipei. Brian is the founder of New Bloom Magazine, an online publication which covers politics and social issues in Taiwan.
Taiwan has had decades of Chinese military threats pointed at it, and there are various times in which those threats seem to be becoming more serious. And so this is definitely one of those times. At the same time, life goes on as usual in Taiwan, and so people are not panicking in the streets.
This isn't to say that the Taiwanese are indifferent about the prospect of invasion. They are not. More than 70% of Taiwanese people told a pollster in 2025 that they want neither independence nor reunification. They want the status quo. They do not want war. But despite growing evidence that Beijing is seeking to invade or at least blockade, only about half of those polled said they believe China represents a serious threat to Taiwan over the next decade. Now, part of this disconnect can be traced back to Taiwan's super messy politics. Today, the KMT is still one of Taiwan's major political parties, but despite being founded by Chiang Kai-shek, the party has evolved to favor a far softer line on China. The third party, the TPP, often takes a similar stance.
And in this sense, you also have this narrative forming about that military preparedness or attempts to prepare for the possibility of war will in fact bring it on. And that points to how right now in the domestic political sphere, for example, the defense budget has been voted down a total of over 10 times by the KMT and TPP, the opposition.
But since 2016, Taiwan has been run by the Democratic Progressive Party. And since 2024, the president has been this guy, William Lai. That's some terrible photos I took of him at an event. And the DPP and Lai seem to be far more anxious about the prospect of invasion. They support far more defense spending and preparations for the prospect of war. But here's the first big hurdle. To some degree, Taiwan is fighting this Cold War against itself. The legislative yuan, Taiwan's parliament, has long been chaotic, but things have been particularly wacky recently, with legislators frequently stealing copies of bills to prevent them from being passed. Just watch. And Brian is right. There has been political deadlock around the country's defense spending. But even if they get that spending passed, it likely won't be enough to significantly transform Taiwan's ability to defend itself. While in the country, I spoke to a number of defense specialists who told me that while Taiwan is innovating some really interesting technological solutions, it is simply moving way too slow. That includes, for example, drones. While Ukraine has stood up a mammoth drone industry, using these cheap, uncrewed systems to make up the gap between itself and a better resourced enemy, Taiwan has not managed to produce more than a few thousand drones, and it really can't seem to settle on plans to do much better. That is the bad news for Taiwan, but that's not the whole story. For starters, all that espionage I mentioned earlier, well, we know about it because Taiwan is getting pretty good at catching those spies. In 2021, Taiwan prosecuted just 3 cases of Chinese espionage. In 2024, that number exploded to 15 cases, implicating 64 people. When it comes to those social media influencers, Taiwan is investigating several TikTokers for advocating annexation, and it has deported some Chinese citizens back to the mainland for their social media content. Speaking to information specialists in Taiwan, I was really struck by the fact that China has gotten much more serious and sophisticated about their influence operations, and yet it doesn't seem to be having a huge effect.
I'm actually rather optimistic about their influence being limited because this was actually stronger, I think, 10, 20 years ago. And that still didn't prevent, for example, something like the 2014 Sunflower Movement, in which young people really took a stand against this drift of the government, which was then KMT controlled, toward China. And I think Chinese influence was in fact stronger at that point in time. We didn't really have, let's say, TikTok being so prevalent, but there was massive economic integration. There was so much tourists in Taiwan from China. And I think the thing of Chinese entertainers and celebrities going to China, that was happening, but I think on a larger scale. At the same time, it is concerning because in the information space, China's gotten savvier, knowing, for example, that if you localize your disinformation or propaganda, that's much more effective than if you hear it and it sounds off immediately that it's from China because this is Chinese Mandarin, not Taiwanese Mandarin, whether in terms of accents or even vocabulary. And so having a localizer, which may be in the sense an influencer or someone who is in fact genuinely local, that's much more effective. And so there has been a learning curve.
It's a learning curve that Taiwan has done pretty well with. And so between China's propaganda, Taiwan's domestic dysfunction, and living under decades of warnings that an invasion is imminent, the Taiwanese people, I think, are a bit cynical about this threat. But critically, they would still overwhelmingly stand up to defend their country if they were invaded. More than 2/3 of the island said they would be very or somewhat willing to fight if needed. That's pretty significant. Which brings me to Taiwan's own strategy to defend itself. And I think it's actually relatively simple. As Francois Wu, Taiwan's Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister, explained to me and my colleagues over lunch, it's all about convincing Xi Jinping to wake up every morning and think, not today.
So making for us 2027 will not happen. So now we have this kind of not today policy. What means not today policy? It means that every day when Xi Jinping wake up, he is shaving, he's looking at himself at the mirror and saying, okay, I want to be the greatest emperor of China. I want to conquer Taiwan. Okay, it's my job. It's my will. It's a reason that I know of my existence. I want to conquer Taiwan, but this is not a good day. I cannot do that. How you can persuade Xi Jinping to say to think, okay, today is not a good day. Even I want.
Now, this is some pretty old school diplomacy. Taiwan figures that the more nations that recognize it as a state, and the more countries and world leaders who care about the fate of its people, the less China will want to risk geopolitical calamity. And Taiwan does this in a bunch of really interesting ways, especially considering that it's not technically a country. Taipei has pushed for entry, with varying degrees of success, to the International Civil Aviation Organization, the World Health Organization, the Olympics, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the World Trade Organization, and a host of other international bodies. Taiwan has also inked trade deals with the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and New Zealand, amongst others, and it's forging ahead on full free trade agreements with the US, the EU, and others. What's more, President Lai has been pushing quite hard for Taiwan to join the upgraded Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a huge trading bloc, which includes a dozen Indo-Pacific countries, but not, notably, China. On top of this, Taiwan has become an incredibly influential international donor, often leading development and aid programs to countries that get overlooked by the rest of the world. Now, I should say, not all of this has been super effective. China has been incredibly good at blackmailing, threatening, and bribing countries into cutting off relations with Taiwan and freezing it out of these international fora and deals.
Would the WHO consider Taiwan's membership? Hello?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I couldn't hear your question.
Okay, yeah. Let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
Right, because I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
But Taiwan seems pretty sure that it doesn't need everyone to get behind it, just enough to make an invasion not worth it. And it has another ace up its sleeve in that regard, which I mentioned earlier, semiconductors. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Limited, or TSMC, is the world's largest contract chip manufacturer. It's basically the linchpin that holds the entire world's electronics market together. It depends on how you slice the numbers, but TSMC produces somewhere between 2/3 and 90% of the world's advanced chips. Apple, in particular, is incredibly reliant on TSMC. To put this in perspective, Bloomberg Economics recently estimated that an invasion of Taiwan could cost the world $10 trillion, or about 10% of the global GDP. That's a pretty good reason to say, not today. So China has big dreams of finally reunifying Taiwan with the mainland. It's pouring money into its military to enable that possibility, and it seems to be preparing for a blockade of the island. It is recruiting spies and spreading propaganda, attempting to brainwash the Taiwanese people into complying. Taiwan, meanwhile, has been slow to build out its defense industry, but it has done thus far a pretty good job of thwarting Beijing's interference and keeping its people relatively unified. What's more, it's been working hard to win friends and influence people, and to remind the world just how important its technology sector is. So that brings us to the big question: does China invade Taiwan in 2027? The short answer is, we don't know, because the question is all wrong. Yes, there are indications that an invasion may be looming. It is widely speculated that Xi Jinping wants to make reunification the crown jewel of his legacy. But as of right now, we don't know if he'll retire at the end of his third term in 2027, or whether he'll stay on until 2035. What we do know is that despite a lot of reporting and a lot of YouTube videos suggesting it, American intelligence never claimed that Beijing would invade in 2027. They said 2027 was the year that China would be ready to invade. We don't know if it's 2027, 2030, 2035, or never. So for now, we're just left waiting and watching this cross-strait Cold War. Now, just a little disclaimer here at the end of the video for transparency. My trip to Taiwan was paid for by the Taiwanese Foreign Affairs Ministry. It was a junket, as we call it, but nothing about this video or any of my work I produced there was seen, approved, or directed by the Taiwanese government. That is it for this episode of Soft Power. My name is Justin Ling. I wrote, hosted, and produced this episode. It was edited by Conway Gaskin. This is all made possible thanks to a very generous grant from Bigger Than Our Borders. You can check them out at biggerthanourBorders.ca.